glass of wine. Your host, Nora Hummel. This week we're going to make pierogies. Those wonderful little filled pockets of dough that actually, if you think about, pretty much every culture has. Italians have ravioli. Eastern Europeans have things like pierogies or pierogi. Don't quote me on that pronunciation, but you know what I'm talking about. And of course, the Chinese dumplings are absolutely famous. I like them fried. My son Edward, he likes them steamed. No accounting for taste. But anyway, I'm going to show you all the ingredients we're going to use today. The dough is going to be made out of flour, eggs, water, and salt. Very simple. The filling is going to be made out of potatoes. I'm using kind of a yellow-fleshed potato today. It's a Yukon Gold, but you could use a regular white potato. It's fine. Some American cheese, some butter, some eggs, and some onions. Now, this cracks me up because recipes will say use an onion. Some recipes will say use a yellow onion, but most recipes will just say use an onion. And not all onions are created equal. First things first, when somebody says use an onion, they are never talking about a red onion unless they specifically talk about it. But these two onions are also not the same. This is a yellow onion, and this is a Spanish onion. The flesh on this onion is incredibly white, and this has a kind of a yellowish tone to it. Never use this when it just calls for an onion, and the reason being, they usually say use a half an onion, use a quarter of an onion, whatever. A half of an onion of this size is going to be extraordinarily different than a half an onion on this side. What they're usually talking about is a medium onion. This would be considered a small onion. So if somebody says use a half an onion, use the full onion if that's all you have. Today, that's actually all I do have. This I will use later when we get to the point of eating the pierogies. I'm pretty much sure you all know how to peel an onion. So I'm not going to show you that step. But for the recipe we're using today, it says to use, because I am actually looking at the recipe, it tells me to use 2 pounds of onions. Well, I'm doubling the recipe because if you're going to make something like pierogies, you want to make a batch of them. So I've got 4 pounds of potatoes that I have already peeled, and I have them at a nice rolling boil here. All right. And I'm sticking a knife in them just to make sure they're done. When your knife goes through them very smoothly, then you know your potatoes are done. Try and have your potatoes at the same size, because then they will all cook at the same rate. It's not an accurate science. You don't have to stand there with a measuring cup or a tape or anything. Approximately the same size. If you have a big one, cut it in half, or 2/4 or 2/3 or something. But always try and have them at the same size. So once they're done, which these have been on the stove probably half hour-ish. You take them and strain your potatoes. Never put a hot pot directly on granite. It will crack. And that's a new top, so I don't want to ruin that. Now I'm going to just take these and put them back in the pot so that I can mash them. And I'm going to move this over to my pastry board, which I've recently found out there's a reason I have a new pastry board. It's a lovely story which I'll share with you at another time, but I gather it has to do with hijinks done at a very young age. All right, so we're going to mash these potatoes. And what we are going to do is we are going to, believe it or not, look at our recipe. And that's the dough. I'm going to show you the dough in a little bit because I want this all cool. This recipe was given to me by a woman whose son I was dating. And she made incredibly good pierogies. You can make pierogies with potato, which is what we're doing. You can do it with a pot cheese, which is also a farmer's cheese or a cottage cheese. You can make them with sauerkraut and mushrooms. And you can also make them with lekvar, which is a prune butter. It was a Danish pierogi. I don't, a dessert pierogi rather. I've never had them. I'm not a prune eater, but people who had them absolutely adored them. So I couldn't even tell you how to cook them. But the most interesting thing about this family, however, was that the woman's father was a Cossack. Or at least the lore in the story says he was a Cossack. So I'm not mashing this like a regular mashed potato. I'm going to mash them with just a masher. I'm not adding milk. I'm not adding salt and pepper. Well, I am adding a little salt and pepper, but I'm not adding a lot of extra. You don't, because you have to be really careful when you make mashed potatoes because you can make them a little too runny if you add too much liquid. This, you want it to be able to hold its form because the filling is going to have to stay together. So, as you can see, we're just going to mash. And see. That's actually pretty good. We're going to mash it again in a few minutes, but I have to cut some onions and saute them for the filling. Oh, don't ever cut on your pastry board. So, we're going to move this stuff off of this for our magical display. I always cut the ends of the onion off, and I just peel. You can see that's got a little bit of a yellowish tint to it. All right, and I'll show you the inside of the other onion, which is a Spanish onion, later on because we're going to use that later on. I am just going to put this in a little bowl. If you have a garden, you should be composting, which is what I do with all the skins and coffee grounds and ends of vegetables. Very important for your own garden. Amends your soil, cuts down on your garbage. All right, so we're going to cut this onion. If you remember, I showed you, just take it, slice it down. If you keep your onions in the refrigerator, I know a lot of people tell you don't do that, you won't cry. Now right now this is actually getting a little oily, so it will bring up tears. But since I'm only doing a small onion, I'm not going to worry too much. Alright, going to get a little pan here. I always keep a little something in between each pan because this stuff, I don't want it to get scratched. Alright, now it tells me to use a heaping tablespoon of butter. That's when you used to buy butter in blocks or in tubs. which I don't usually do. All right, so we're gonna put that there, but it's nice and soft. And as soon as that butter melts, we're gonna saute it, the onions that I just cut. Okay, so now the butter has achieved meltedness, and you can hear it's got a little brown going, which is fine in this instance. Okay, you have to be careful. Remember, I don't know if you remember, but I have talked about brown butter. Brown butter is actually fine, but for the other item I was doing, when I was doing the mushroom caps a while back, I didn't want brown butter. Now, if I was upset about the flavor of this brown butter, I would have just dumped it out. We're talking about a tablespoon of butter. We're going to ruin the whole dish over a tablespoon of butter. But here it's fine. I'm going to let that go for a little bit. We'll come back to it in a couple of seconds. We're going to have to add, at the end, I'm going to add some American cheese. And that's all this is. This is just sliced American cheese. And right here, how many? I had to give you a couple things of stack, so we could see it on the screen. So right now I've got about 4 slices of American cheese. I'm using a white American, but you could use a yellow. Doesn't matter. It's whatever you prefer. And I'm just kind of dicing it a little. All right. This particular project, I'm making something like pierogies or ravioli, anything like that. If you're making it in batches, it is in fact a big project. It's fun, don't get me wrong, but it's one of those projects that if you like to cook with other people, this is a project you can have lots of people do. I have a friend, Pat Logan. Hi, Pat. She used to make pierogies all the time, but pierogies are not vegan, so she doesn't eat them and she doesn't make them as much. But she was making them in such big batches. She'd have a crowd over, and I believe she said she went through 4 KitchenAids. That big pierogi dough can be very heavy. So I make the dough by hand because I'm not making 1,000 pierogies, which is kind of what she would do in a day. All right. We still want to just get these a little softer.
Can I ask, because I know other people are going to ask, do you have to add cheese?
No, you don't. The cheese will help lighten it a little bit because if you remember, we didn't add mashed potatoes, milk to those mashed potatoes. But you don't have to add cheese. Heck, you don't have to add onion. You could probably just do it like this. It's just you want to blend some flavors. You know, a pierogi in its very nature is going to be a little heavy. So if you can lighten up the flavors, I know you think cheese and onion's not going to lighten it up, but actually it is. It's going to give it a little diversity of flavor. All right, so I think these are good. All right. We're going to add this. We're going to add the onions to the pot. I'm going to mash that in a little bit. And we're adding the cheese. Clean as you go. There you go. And I'm going to mash. Now, I will add a little salt and pepper to this, but just a touch. Potatoes, so I'd say that maybe like 1/4 teaspoon, maybe 1/8. And I'm going to grind some fresh pepper. You could use white pepper in this. Very little pepper, 1/8 of a teaspoon or less. I mentioned it in the last episode, but one of the reasons I don't add a lot of salt items that have cheese in it is because salt is in most cheeses. So if you're adding cheese to a dish, you're also adding salt to the dish. So you have to be very careful about how much salt you add, because salt can easily be over added. The nice thing about potatoes, however, while it won't take away all of the salt, if you're making something like a sauce or something that's got too much, when you taste it's got a little too much salt, add a potato, don't add a pepper. Add a potato, you can pull it out, but that'll help absorb some of the salt. If you've over salted it, it's not going to do the job, but it will help a little bit. So we're going to taste this. Cameraman's do her wage. Why don't you taste the filling?
That's good.
Okay, so see, but did you get a little bit of cheese in there and a little onion? So that's why you lightened that up. Okay. Son Edward, would you like to taste the filling?
Sure.
I know I shouldn't be touching my nose, people. It's not hot. It's
Nice.
nice. Okay. Well, that's the seal of approval. All right. So I'm going to put this aside and let it cool, and then I'm going to get set up so that I can show you our dough. All right. The potatoes are over there cooling. I'm set up. You'll see a splash of flour on there. I'll explain that in a little bit. But they're cooling. They should rest a few moments. What we're going to do now is make the dough for the pierogi. I have here 2 cups of regular all-purpose flour. Doesn't have to be special. I like to use unbleached. Use whatever you have. Do not use a self-rising. Do not use a cake. Use regular all-purpose. All right. Here is half a teaspoon of salt, 2 eggs, and half a cup of water. All right. Now, I actually made enough potatoes for 2 batches. I think I said that earlier. I've already made a batch of dough. It's done. Because this dough is going to have to rest for 10 minutes once it's finished, but I really don't want you to have to wait to see it. So what we're going to do is we're going to make this dough, let it rest, and then we'll work with the other and start making some pierogies. But I am going to turn on pot of boiling, unsalted water. Once again, only water that you should salt usually, as far as I'm concerned, are water that you're using to cook lobsters, and maybe some pasta. All right, so we take 2 eggs, we make a hole in the center of the flour, put our eggs directly in there. Okay. Put that in our compost stack, and you use 2 knives. Keep working this in. When this flour stops being wet is when I will stop doing this. It's just about where we need it to be. It's not all broken, it's not all added in, or the flour's not all added in, but that's okay. So I'm going to take my knife. Alright. I'm going to add a little under a half a teaspoon of salt to my water, which is a 1/2 cup of water. Take your rings off. You don't want to get them all messy. Add the water a little bit at a time because it'll ooze out, as you can see maybe. In a couple minutes we're going to be in good shape. And we're just going to mix this and knead it. If you don't have one of these, which is a pastry cutter, or a bread knife, or scraper, you can use a knife. And this is acting a little wetter than I would like. So what I'm actually going to do is I'm going to ask Serenia to cut the camera so I can get a little more flour and just add a little more flour. Alright, so what we just did, so that I didn't mess up my whole house because these hands are wet, I asked Serenia to sprinkle on a little less than a rounded tablespoon of flour. We may still have to add some more. What's happened is the size of the eggs. The size of the eggs can determine that you might wind up using a little less water. I added most of the water, but there was still even a little water left when I saw that it was getting a little too wet. So scrape that. But this looks better. You can even see that it looks much drier. And then I just took a little extra flour, not a big deal. Okay. See, you know it's not quite dry enough if it's still sticking to your board that much, because it's fairly well floured. Yeah, I think we're good. Because when we roll this dough, we're going to add flour to it anyway. All right. So we're going to let this rest for 10 minutes. You could put a towel over it if you want, but you don't have to. You can put it in a bowl. But we're going to get to it in 10 minutes, so I'm just going to leave it sit here. All right. And I'm going to wash my hands, and we'll be right back. So, this is the dough I made last night. It's given us clearly has the 10 minutes of rest it needed. You need dough to rest because of elasticity. If you try to roll the dough that you have just made, it's going to give you a hard time. The gluten has to break back down and all of that. So I've let it rest. I let this one rest overnight because I wanted to be ready for today. And now I've just taken my table, sprinkled flour on it, and rubbed my dough in the flour, because that will help keep it from sticking. Also take your rolling pin and put some flour on that, because that will also help. This is, I think, is called a French rolling pin. It isn't the one you're used to seeing with people using in this country that has the handles on each side and just rolls along. It's what everyone you choose to use. I use both of them, but for this I like to use this because I can do this. This is one of those doughs, if you're doing a pie crust, if it has a hole or something in it, not such a big deal because it'll help allow steam to escape. Pierogies, however, you cannot have holes because what will escape is your filling. I'm trying to get this to be about 1/4 to 1/8 of an inch thick. Now, I wanted to be fancy and use a, cookie cutter. Except it turns out cookie cutter is smaller than I want. So you take an everyday household glass, put it in a little bit of flour, because this will not stick to the dough, and just cut rounds. So we have 6 rounds cut here. We're going to take about a tablespoon, a little less. Put it in your dough pocket. Take a little water, because you want to seal this. What doesn't get sealed is going to ooze out. These will ooze out. I should have this over here. So let's do that. I really shouldn't put it in the middle of my dough, but I want to show you how to make 6 of these first before we move on to the next step. And I have 2 batches of dough to work and a double batch of filling. So try to keep your fingertips as clean as possible, which for me always seems to be impossible. You can tell if they're sealed. This one's sealed nicely because there's no breaks. All right. What's that? So I said a tablespoon, probably more like a round teaspoon. Now see what I talked about with holes? See, as I move it around, I saw a little hole there, so I just pinched it. Because if you have those holes, that filling is going to ooze out. This is not a hard dish, it's actually very simple. What it is more than anything else is a time-consuming dish. So even to make a small amount of these takes a bit of time. So bring over friends you like cooking with, family who owe you a favor, or want to eat them, and work together. version of everybody making pierogies. And it is everybody. We probably made about 4 dozen pierogies out of 2 batches of dough and about 1.5 batches of the potatoes. Never fear, the potatoes will not go to waste. They did not die in vain. They will be eaten as mashed potatoes. They're delicious. You know, we've all tasted the filling and we can guarantee it. Now, over here I have some sauteed onions. You've seen me dice onions this episode, so you don't, we'll let that tell you it's warm. So you didn't need to see me do it again. That, however, is that big Spanish onion that I did. You'll see what happens with those. We'll just, they're going along in a nice clip. And as you can see, it's margarine. Margarine is not burning.
How much margarine is in here?
Okay, this is about 1.5 sticks of margarine to 1 large Spanish onion. And as you can see, some of them are starting to brown up on the edges a little bit. So we're close to a good place for them. So the onions themselves will be we're waiting for them to brown a little. What we're going to do is we're going to put them over some of the non-sauteed potatoes. The sauteed potatoes we're going to throw in that hot pan directly. So what we're going to do, this is at a nice rolling boil. These have sat, and I'm going to just check to make sure that they haven't, opened up in any way. Do not crowd your pan, because if you crowd your pan, they're not going to cook properly. So we're going to watch that a second while they start coming up. In a couple of seconds I may put a slotted spoon under them, but they'll need to float. And when they do, that means they're done. Alright? And we'll come back. Okay, so these pierogies are starting to float to the top, and I'm just removing them with a slotted spoon. And right now, I'm going to put them in just a regular baking dish. And as you can see, well, that's not the prettiest one, but I'm betting it's one of the best tasting ones. And now we have, right here we only have, well, we have 4, 8, we have 8. So we have about 40 more to do. And when we're at that point, I'll come back when they're finished. Okay, so we've removed all of our pierogies from the pot of boiling water. We had about 48 pierogies, I think, maybe a few more, but that's pretty good. We only lost 2, the 2 for the pot. Those are the only 2 that there might have been a hole in, or a hole came in when I had to get it off from the bottom. That's pretty darn good. So what I've done now is I took some of the onions that were sauteing in that pan out, and I've put them over just the boiled pierogies. And I'm going to put them in the oven so that they stay hot, and you can try them like that. Because there's a lot of people who like that. They don't necessarily saute the pierogies. So I'm putting in they're warm. I'm going to, you know what, I'm going to, been off for a while, so I'm going to turn up the heat on that a little bit. I'm going to bake it at 350. It's not really baking it. It's just to get it hot. Then the rest of the margarine and onion, I've put a few pierogies in there. The others we'll save for later. We'll freeze them. They will freeze up very nicely. But you can see now why it's a project and that you want people cooking with you. Because if I had had to do all of this by myself, it would have taken me most of the day and half the night to do a true batch on things. So we're going to saute these up quite nicely, I hope. And we're going to let that go. Now you can use these as a side dish. You can use them as the main course. If you go meatless, this is a perfect meatless meal. We're gonna saute these up, and we're just gonna serve them with a little sour cream on the side. You could serve it with a salad, but you can also do bratwursts and in a brown gravy, or you could do brats in sauerkraut. Now they're starting to saute up. I don't want to let them sit too long on each side. We want to get a little color on them. And I personally like the fact that they're not all even looking. It tells you they're homemade. It means they're all made with love. Okay, so we're doing that. Oh yeah, see they're starting to just brown a little bit. Ah, they're slipping around. These have a lot of onions, but you put your onions in to taste. You may like a lot of onions. I don't think I'd use more than I have here. This is probably about a half an onion. And I'll probably put a few more pierogies in there. In a few minutes, we're going to plate these up. And we are going to sit down and have them with a little sour cream. That is all they require. If you do the hot cheese, you could do sour cream as well, and even the mushroom and sauerkraut. I don't think you would do this portion with the lekvar, the prune. Like I said, I've never made them. I think you might actually boil them just a little, maybe put a little confectioner sugar to sweeten it up. But that would be your experiment. Sometimes experimenting is the way to go, because you never know what you're going to find. As Edison said, about the 100th try on the light bulb, he had found 99 things that hadn't worked previously. So we're going to plate these up, and we'll be back in a few minutes. Alright, so that was today's big adventure, making pierogies on cooking with a big glass of wine. And as I like to say, eat well, eat happy, and eat with those you love. Come on in, guys. Especially thanks to all the people who helped make pierogies. La time! Somebody please dig in. Take one sauteed and one just boiled. Serve yourself.
Thank you.
And put a little sour cream on the plate if you like.
Very nice.
Okie dokie.
Oh, good.
Take care. Until next time.
Right? Yeah, good boy. Yes. Okay.
Hello.
Holy crap, Yuri. That's like completely clean.
I wouldn't eat that.